Greetings, everyone, and welcome again to the Shepherd's Voice Magazine YouTube channel. We're sure happy you could be here with us today. I know these messages, these multi-part ones, they're not always the most electrifying things. Probably not exactly riveting you to your chair, having you hang on every word that I'm saying, but that's okay as long as you'll perhaps endure the next several minutes or so as we go through this next portion of other people's mail. This will be the second part, and I'm not going to recap the entirety of my last message as we get going today. I always did find that kind of odd that when multi-part messages would be brought out, that the first third was actually kind of a summarizing of what the last message said. And being as we have the beauty of YouTube, and you can go back and you can watch any one of our messages on the YouTube channel, I would encourage you to look about 2 weeks ago, and it was the message called Other People's Mail Part 1. Oddly enough. Well, there you go. But what I wanted to say really at the outset here is that these kind of messages I feel are important. I hope you do too. Are so that we can they're more of a how-to on how to read some of these scriptures and how to approach them, because the one thing I will reiterate from last time is that context is what bears out the meaning for us when it comes to these things that we're reading. And the more equipped we are, and the more able that we are to read through these scriptures and more become aware of some of the pitfalls that people throw at you and some of the teachings that are out there, and not to cast aspersions on any group in particular at all, just that as in any topic, there are differing views on how things are written in the context they're in, and we need to be as aware as we can about these sorts of things, so that we don't get caught off guard or easily taken off the rails, because as we all have experienced, and we've at least witnessed over time, there are instances where people have been so very easily taken off. And often it's folks that you wouldn't exactly expect it to be. So that's just what I kind of wanted to say at the outset. Also, I wanted to add, I really loved Jim's message last week. I think that was a very important topic and a tough topic to dive into. Especially with the world climate the way it is, in terms of the geopolitical situations going on in the Middle East and in Europe and so forth. It's a heavy topic, and it's not like we don't get a fair amount of questions. And I hope his message did answer some questions for some of you out there that I know were rather specific in what our viewpoint ought to be. And, as Jim pointed out, our viewpoint ought to be that from where God sees things, and the bigger picture that God has presented for us, because after all, everything does begin and end with Him. This is why Jesus Christ says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, I'm the beginning and the end. So these are just some things I wanted to say at the outset, and I really enjoyed his Al Waxman reset there from the King of Kensington TV show in the 80s. Mostly the Canadians will probably know that particular show. He also played on another one for the American viewers. Cagney and Lacey was kind of a cop show. Two ladies were partner cops in. It was in the 1980s, and Al Waxman played their lieutenant. He was the guy that was always yelling at them. But he was the King of Kensington, and I remember as a kid, as Jim watched that as well. At the end of the credits, at the beginning of the show, it always said, "What a guy! What a guy!" I just thought that was a terrific reset. I hadn't even thought of the King of Kensington in decades, probably. So, anyways, as I said, I don't want to recap last week's message. Please go ahead and watch that yourself on the SVM YouTube channel here. If you need to refresh your memory, you can watch it after this one. This message too will be a lot of kind of what these scriptures are talking about in Romans and the direction that this letter was taking. And some of it we're going to read, and some of it I'm going to point to you so that you can read these things on your own. I want you guys to come to the understanding on your own as well by reading some of this stuff. Now, as you go through this body of scripture between Romans, literally Romans 1 to 12, basically. There's some language in there that gets talking about the commandments and law and all that, and we're going to jump over top of that stuff this time around. And the reason is because we're already kind of tackling that in other messages that Jim and I are doing here lately, is bringing kind of an awareness to the contexts wherein the commandments and the law live and how they apply to us. And we've done several messages already, and we will likely continue to do so as time goes on. So as it pertains to this, however, it's not really quite as germane to the topic that we're looking at here. Which is, and we ended last time looking at the first part of Romans, chapter 1, and got down to what we got down to somewhere probably verses 16 or 17 of Romans 2 or 3 or something like that we got in there. Or probably Romans, probably just the first half of Romans 1. It's a very large chapter. So we're taking a look at the letter that is Paul's communication to the church at Rome, and as it relates to a couple of things. And this is what we were bringing out as important. This is what we wanted to highlight. And it's that we want to reject replacement theory. I'll just state that outright. We're rejecting replacement theory. And that being, of course, the theory that the Gentile believers in Christ are replacing or have replaced the Jews, and this being done as a punitive measure against Israel's rejection of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's kind of where that lies, and we're rejecting the position that states that Romans 10, 11, and 12 are parenthetical inserts as opposed to a perfectly aligned, portions of this discourse that Paul was having with the believers at Rome. Thus, we are reading other people's mail. So we'll get to those chapters eventually, 10, 11, and 12. This part 2 here is by no means going to be the last of this particular series. There's probably going to be at least one more, I'd say, and perhaps 2. But we'll save that for later. But we'll get to those chapters as we go. We'll round things out so that this all kind of makes sense. And that way, when you do pick up your Bible, and you look through Romans and you see this and you hear somebody say something kind of weird, then you can go, nah, I don't think so. I think we have other proofs here that we can deal with. So I'll take another sip of coffee as we get going. Jim has tea. I have coffee in my mug from the Laughlin Tropicana Hotel where Carrie and I used to stay many, many moons ago. I drink French roast coffee. I like it strong. I like stuff that'll curl my hair almost. So as we concluded our last message, we noted that the beginning of Romans 1, we'll call it Romans 1a for right now, it kind of described the reasons for the letter, and we got this brief, rough history. And it gave shape to the reasons for the letter. And the history was kind of a sketch history. It's not exactly in-depth. But today what we'll do is we'll begin at the second portion of Romans 1, beginning somewhere around the 18th verse, and going on to, I would imagine today we might get to the first half of chapter 3. I don't want to keep you here making your bum go numb and flat as you sit and stare at the TV wondering what old Darren's talking about. So if you go to Romans chapter 1, we'll kind of break into the second half of the chapter there. And of course, what we're looking at here is how there's no way that the Jewish people can be replaced in some sort of theory like this because they're so definitely highlighted and spoken of specifically throughout the book of Romans. Okay, this is a letter, and he's addressing it to people. So he addresses. We'll see today that he is addressing them as well, the Gentile folks, the Greek as it's worded, those hearers as well, and how that kind of comes together, what kind of confluence that actually is, because it doesn't come off in this whole British Israel thing that we've kind of gone over numerous times, ad nauseum probably, but how important it is to not have a misunderstanding in that direction that takes your faith off in a different direction. Okay, because Paul is really careful throughout everything that he says here in his letters. And throughout his Gospels as well, his Gospel messages as well, how he directs the attention towards the glory of God and how it is through Jesus Christ and through faith that we come to this relationship. So, verse 18, Romans 1. It's talking about the guilt of the Gentile world. It says, for God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. And verse 19 says, since we can be known, so what can be known about God is evident among them because God has shown it to them. Verse 21 says, for though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, in their thinking, it became nonsense, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. In verse 23, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Okay, so what's going on here? What are we talking about? This is talking about the sins of men and the corresponding wrath of God. And in doing so, it first identifies Gentile sin. Okay, and that begins there in chapter 1, verse 16, this blatant and open sin. So chapter 3 in this way, in this context, identifies boasting as another outward sin of the Gentile world. However, that'll come more to light as we get further on in chapter 3. But let's look at the chapter 1 example of Paul identifying that Gentile tendency in terms of sin. So what do we have going on? They went from losing a correct mindset to one of nonsense, and they were darkened. Because once they were senseless, then it was a slippery slope into darkness. So basically, what this is saying is that they went from bad to worse. Okay, and then verse 24 says, "Therefore God delivered them over in the cravings of their hearts." To sexual impurity, so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. Verse 25, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served something created instead of the Creator, who is praised forever. Amen. Okay, so this is confirming what we just read about the senselessness and darkening. Okay, and what that means is God will get involved. And at times, God will harden the heart of an individual. And in this case, it's talking about a group of individuals. And what we need to kind of make a note of here in chapter, in this set of verses here in chapter 1, is that he's speaking in the third person. Okay? Of they, speaking in terms of the immorality the Gentiles had. Okay, so then moving on to some commentary in chapter 2. Once we get into chapter 2, we're going to notice how that changes now to you Okay, so this means he's talking to the Jews at that point. So he was talking about they, the Gentiles, and he outlined how their sin, or kind of a summary of the type of sin that they were committing. Okay, they, and then in chapter 2, let's go over to Romans chapter 2, and begin in verse 17. Romans chapter 2 and verse 17. And this begins to describe the Jewish violation under the law. Okay? Notice that one isn't scrubbing out the other in any way. We're just drawing some lines here. Verse 17. Now, if you can call yourself a Jew and rest in the law, boast in God, know his will, approve all things as superior, all these sorts of things. Okay, so it goes into a whole lot of talk about the law here. And it says you've convinced yourself that you're a guide for the blind, an instructor to the ignorant. And you say you're not going to steal and you're not going to commit adultery, detest idols. Verse 23 says, you who boast in the law, do you dishonor, when you do this, you dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Okay, so what's all this saying? It's a warning about the secretive sin of hypocrisy. They were saying one thing and doing another. Okay, if you look at the temple authority at the time, it was as political as Rome, right? So this is what he's getting at. Not only were they being hypocrites about it, saying one thing and doing another, and this starts to get into a pretty special brand of legalism, doesn't it? And it's based in untruth, and it's based in hiding something. But they were hiding behind the law as they were kind of throwing stones at everything else. So again, I'd say that we can see the Jewish people factoring in quite specifically as it would be for the people that these are the folks that Paul was talking to. And that's important here because Paul makes it kind of personal to himself. Okay? He rounds out chapter 2. I know we kind of just drifted right on over into chapter 2. You'll find that's how this goes. Romans 2, 25, he talks about circumcision. And he says it benefits you if you observe the law, but if you're a lawbreaker, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So he's relating to them on a level that he was familiar with. Because, of course, he was born a Jew. Simple as that. So this is an incredible position for Paul to articulate, because you see in verse 26 he also says, so if the uncircumcised man keeps the law's requirements, will not his uncircumcision then be counted as circumcision? Isn't it neat how Paul is speaking to them? He's writing this portion and for a Jewish hearer that's going to hear this in a certain way. In my estimation, he's following Christ's lead in this. Because I know I said it in my last message or two, and I know Jim has said it in numerous messages. Jesus Christ goes well out of his way to come to where you are. To be where you are. To, offer everything that goes into his sacrifice and this propitiation that he has made of himself for us, for you, for me. He comes to where you are. He goes well out of his way to do that. And I think this is an example of Paul doing that and how he's writing the bulk of Romans, I would say. These things were presented, that's a long way of saying these things were presented to the reader or the hearer in a certain way so as to spark something in their mind. Something to motivate further consideration of things that were most likely taken for granted, perhaps, or simply accepted over time. See the similarity there to us? If we want to look at something through our lens, we've all been the frog in the frying pan at one time or another. And oftentimes it's because somebody claimed they had the authority and said something was just so. I know we've all had experiences in that direction. Let's keep going in Romans 2, verse 27. I've got to keep up with myself and my notes here. I'm working with notes on the screen. I'm working with notes on paper. I'm all over the map this week. Verse 27, a man who is physically uncircumcised and keeps the law. Okay, we've already read all that part. Verse 28 says, for a person is not a Jew who is outwardly, and true circumcision is not something that is visible in the flesh. Verse 29 says, on the contrary, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart by the Spirit, not the letter. That person's praise is not from the people, but from God. Okay? So it's talking about having a particular mindset and where our hearts are in terms of the acceptance of Jesus Christ and taking on that walk, moving ahead in faith. As always, we'll see that these things circle around faith, or they're centered in faith. Okay? So let's jump over to chapter 3. We can kind of keep rolling right along here. In chapter 3, we're going to see something fascinating because it's in here that I can't understand how the rest of it gets kind of conflated, thrown out of whack. This is the portion of Romans where Paul drives home the point about the Jew and the Gentile being equal on the basis of sin. And this is where the pronoun is changed. Everybody wants to be wild about the pronouns these days. These were some pretty simple pronouns here. He changes the pronoun to we. And we'll see that in the turn of phrase as he says, all are sinners. Okay? All are sinners. So from the beginning of our message to this point, we've first seen the outline of the Gentile sin and then how the Jew has sinned, right? And idolatry and sexual immorality and boasting thereof and pridefulness in that direction coming out of the Gentiles. And then we had hypocrisy and a hiding behind the law of the Jews. So both are sin. Okay? So then it finally comes together here. In Romans 3, and we're going to read this, where it says, all have sinned. Because the whole world is guilty before God. So verse 9 of Romans 3, it says, what then? Are we any better? We? Okay, remember when we said when he says we, he's talking about his fellow sons of Israel, fellow people born Jewish. Says, what then? Are we any better? Not at all. Not at all. For we have previously charged that both Jews and Gentiles are all under sin. Verse 10. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. It means that it is not of anyone's nature to first seek God. Okay? In verse 12, all have turned away, all alike have become useless. I love the way Paul writes. There was no one who does what is good, not even one. So, of course, we see this is super strong language that's being used here. So he's trying to emphasize something. And notice, I'm sorry, but you just can't have a replacement of one or the other when the writer is talking all. Right? Verse 13, more strong language. Their throat is an open grave. They deceive with their tongues. Viper's venom is under their lips. In verse 14, their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and wretchedness are in their paths. And the path of peace they have not known. In verse 18, there is no fear of God before their eyes. This is a heck of an indictment that he's laying down. And the only people he's singling out is everyone. Clearly, the divide isn't between Jew and Gentile here. There's no divide there, but rather between God and all man. I can't overstate how huge of a distinction this is, as opposed to the us versus them outlook or viewpoint, mentality, however you want to say it. And again, God's message through Jesus Christ has always been about getting through to those who will respond. Those who will respond. Let's keep going in chapter 3. Go a little bit further in chapter 3 here. Look at that, all my talking. We're already at 28 minutes and change. I mean, does Darren ever knock it off? No. Romans 3, let's go to verse 21. Yeah, verse 21. Let's see what God's righteousness is about and how we can maybe get a glimpse of that or take part in that. Seems like a much more positive endeavor, no? Verse 21, but now, apart from the law, God's righteousness has been revealed, attested by the law and the prophets. That is, God's righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe, since there is no distinction. We're all in this together. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's a familiar scripture, no? Verse 24. They are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. God presented him as a propitiation through faith in his blood to demonstrate his righteousness. Because in his restraint, God passed over the sins previously committed. And this is the reach-back effect that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ has. Okay? Up to that point. He said, in his restraint, he passed over sins previously committed. But remember how it said that Paul said that because of the sin of the Jews, that the name of God was blasphemed amongst the Gentiles. Notice how that script is flipped here. That God sent Jesus Christ as this sacrifice and propitiation for these sins and demonstrates his righteousness, not the blaspheming of his name and character. Oh, no, 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 no. And again, this is about his righteousness, not ours. In verse 26, this is one that can be taken personally for us. It was personal for Paul and those that he was writing to at that time. But this is personal for us. Verse 26, Romans 3. God presented him to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time. At the present time. So that he would be righteous and declare righteous the one who has faith in Jesus. So here the narrative is switching to justification and what it means to both Jews and Gentiles by identifying that which is supposed to unite them. See? It's all about transformation. Verse 21 states that apart from the law which the Jews had, right? That is, in prophecy and in reality and in faith, Jesus Christ has been revealed to all of us. And it was revealed to bring us out of the sin that was covering us all. So that there's no distinction on either side. There's no distinction in who has sinned. But on the other side of that, there's also no distinction in who will be made righteous. It's about those who have faith in Jesus, which means those who will respond to what? This is my only begotten Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. For emphasis, this was revealed to bring us out of the sin that was indeed covering us all. And hopefully we can come away seeing that so far in Romans there's still no indication of replacement, okay, in terms of the Jews. And, you know, we'll pick up with the justification portion of Romans probably on my next message as we head towards delving into those non-parenthetical chapters of Romans 9, 10, and 11. Because Romans chapter 3, the second half, I'll just give you a little sketch outline. I'll tell you. Here's the portion where I'll tell you kind of what you can kind of read on your own. All right? I'll give you a little handful of things to look at. The second half of chapter 3 and on into chapter 5. Again, I said the narrative switches to justification, and it tells of faith, the faith that the Jew and the Gentile need to be justified by Jesus Christ. It's for all. Chapters 4 and 5. That starts talking, it goes way back, and he starts talking of Abraham, you know. the circumcised and the uncircumcised, and the implied spiritual application. Let's see, 4 and 5. Yeah, it goes into that'll go into the fall of the Jew and the Gentile in Adam. Okay, so he provides all kinds of examples there in those portions of the letter. Again, showing how we are united in this sin that was covering us. And that through the grace of God. Thankfully, we've been moved forward from that. Chapters 6 to 8, it talks about that goes. The narrative switches again then from sanctification, from justification to sanctification. All right, because there's a distinction there, and he outlines the dangers of backsliding and failing to reach the goal of sanctification, and what all that means. And these are things that we're going to tackle in other messages. It gets on a lot more about the relationship, that we're having, and what we're supposed to have, and the ideal circumstance, which starts with a willing heart and an open mind and a willingness to accept context and what these scriptures are saying. And like I said, this is kind of a how-to, I guess. And I don't want to claim like I'm some sort of professor or anything. It's not like that at all. I'm a painter for the school board in Calgary who happens to be a preacher. It's just I don't think we spend enough time maybe sometimes looking at how we're supposed to look at these. And, what is the book of Romans? Like I said at the outside of the first message that I did. This is not the gospel of Paul to the church at Rome. This is definitely a letter because he was trying to bring fellowship after terrible circumstances that had torn the Jewish folks away and brought them back, and the attitude that had changed within the Gentile converts at the time and the Jewish converts at the time and people that had been repatriated there to Rome. There was a schism that was about to happen. I think it was a real pressure cooker at that time. And there was probably a lot of pressure on Paul, and I think he internalized this, and I think he really took this stuff to heart. And that's why this letter was written. But we just can't come to this idea that the Jew has been completely rejected or become permanently cut off as God's chosen people. And the next chapters of Romans will begin to bear that out. And we're going to reach that portion of the book. That, as I said, is often thought of as parenthetical. And I want us to take careful consideration of how we read the scriptures that are in the Bible, gleaning the lessons, and God willing, they reach our heart and they make us think and spark something in us to consider. But you know what? I'm out of pages. If you've been around for a while, you know what that means. It means I'm out of time. And you're probably like, oh boy, he could have probably knocked this off about 15 minutes ago, but that's all right. I'm being self-deprecating today. I'm just joking. I am very happy to do these messages. I do enjoy doing them. I hope they're of use to you and a blessing to you. I know Olivia gets a kick out of the out of pages, out of time thing. I'll say hello to Olivia out there in Penticton. So with that, I'll close for today and look forward to bringing you Part 3 of Other People's Mail. Happy Sabbath, folks, and we'll see you next time on Shepherd's Voice Magazine.